Ladies and gentlemen, today we look at Trump's inaugural address as he begins another term. In his opening remarks, Trump confidently declared, "The golden age of America begins right now." If that phrase sounds familiar, it's because it should. He said it back in 2017, and much like a rerun of a show that wasn't that great the first time, we're being told once again that everything will be bigger, better, and more beautiful than ever. But the reality is that Trump's previous term was marked by economic turbulence, ballooning national debt, and controversial policy decisions that left the nation more divided than united. His bold claim that America will become the envy of every nation conveniently overlooks some inconvenient facts. Rising income inequality, a healthcare system still in critical condition, and infrastructure crumbling faster than his legal defenses. Reclaiming national pride is his tagline, but slogans have to meet substance at some point. Then there's his promise to restore justice and eliminate corruption. An interesting pivot, considering his first term was, let's say, morally flexible. His vow to end the weaponization of government institutions also raises an eyebrow or two, especially when you consider that many of those so-called weaponized institutions were busy investigating him. So the question is, will this administration finally deliver on its grand promises, or is this just another season of The Apprentice, White House edition? Let's break it down and see what's really going on behind this curtain, because the legacy of Trump's previous term presents a more complicated reality, one characterized by soaring national debt, deepening economic divides, and thankfully, unfulfilled policy commitments. Now, economic growth did occur during Trump's first term, but it was at a significant cost. The national debt ballooned to $7.8 trillion, reaching historic levels. While unemployment rates dipped, wealth inequality surged, with the top 1% continuing to amass disproportionate wealth, deepening economic divides. Trump's claim that America will become the envy of every nation glosses over unresolved domestic crises. The nation's healthcare system remains fractured, with millions uninsured or underinsured. Meanwhile, infrastructure, which is frequently touted as a priority, continues to deteriorate, earning a dismal C- rating from the American Society of Civil Engineers. And that's our guys. American civil engineers. They're on our team. Equally dubious is Trump's vow to restore justice and end corruption. His first term was marred by legal and ethical controversies, including high-profile investigations into his business dealings and allegations of obstruction of justice. His promise to end the so-called weaponization of government institutions is particularly ironic, considering his frequent attempts to undermine federal oversight and institutions that investigated his administration. Ah, yes, the classic Trump playbook. When in doubt, play the martyr. But let's be honest, Trump's legal troubles and public scrutiny didn't arise from shadowy cabals of deep state operatives. They came from his actions, documented, investigated, and backed by mountains of evidence, not just political vendettas. Trump's dramatic declaration that he's been tested and challenged more than any president in our 250-year history is a bold claim, especially when you consider Abraham Lincoln actually fought in a civil war and Richard Nixon's challenges ended with him waving from a helicopter. Trump's battles? multiple civil and criminal investigations into his business dealings, campaign conduct, and that little insurrection attempt. Those weren't political hit jobs. They were bipartisan efforts rooted in oversight and evidence. His portrayal of government agencies as vicious and violent and unfair tools of political persecution ignores a simple reality. These institutions have oversight and legal checks, something Trump's businesses never quite mastered. The Department of Justice, for instance, doesn't just wake up and decide to investigate someone for fun. It follows the evidence, which in Trump's case was plentiful. Whether it was pressuring state officials to find votes or attempting to overturn a certified election, Trump's actions placed him firmly in the crosshairs. No conspiracy required. But Trump isn't just selling his victimhood. He's handing out self-pity like MAGA hats at a rally. Lines like, "A radical and corrupt establishment has extracted power and wealth from our citizens," are designed to convince his supporters they're part of the same grand persecution. The reality? His policies did more for Wall Street than they did for Main Street, benefiting the ultra-rich while working-class Americans got the short end of the stick. Let's not kid ourselves. Trump's victim complex is a well-worn political tactic, one used by leaders throughout history to evade accountability and keep their base emotionally invested. But here's the real problem. When people start believing the system is rigged against them, they stop participating. And that is the end game. Eroding trust in democracy while consolidating power in the hands of one man who claims to be their only savior. Trump's speech portrays him as a tragic hero fighting against insurmountable odds. But the actual story is about a man facing the logical consequences of his actions. He also dusted off an old favorite, declaring a national emergency at the southern border, promising to halt all illegal entry and deport millions and millions of criminal aliens. Trump once again leaned into his greatest hits: fear, exaggeration, and a flair for ignoring reality. The so-called invasion he speaks of, border apprehension data from the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, tells a much different story. Unauthorized crossings fluctuate based on economic and political conditions, not some grand conspiracy of migrant masterminds plotting a hostile takeover. And here's a fun fact. Most undocumented immigrants have been here for over a decade, contributing to local economies, communities, and brace yourself, paying taxes. Unlike certain real estate moguls we could mention. Trump! Excuse me. I'm allergic to bullshit. Trump's desire to bring back policies like Remain in Mexico and Catch and Release conveniently forget the disastrous consequences of those policies. The migrant protection protocols, for example, forced asylum seekers into dangerous conditions, often violating international legal standards. Meanwhile, separating families at the border, because nothing says law and order like traumatizing children, was internationally condemned as human rights violations. But sure, let's run it back like it's a reboot no one asked for. And then there's the classic trope of an immigrant-driven crime wave. Research consistently shows that immigrants, both documented and undocumented, commit crimes at lower rates than native-born citizens. But why let facts get in the way of a good scare tactic? By focusing on isolated cases to justify sweeping policies, Trump continues to sell a narrative that has more plot holes than his business ventures. Of course, what he doesn't mention is how immigrants are essential to industries like agriculture, construction, and healthcare. Sectors that without their labor would crumble faster than his casino empire. Mass deportation is a drum he beats constantly, but as experts estimate, it could shrink the U.S. economy by a staggering $1 trillion over the next decade. That's right, it turns out xenophobia isn't great for business. At the end of the day, Trump's border rhetoric isn't about practical solutions. It's about maintaining an illusion of crisis to rally his base. The reality? America doesn't need more walls. It needs comprehensive immigration reform that balances economic needs with humane policies. But hey, why fix a problem when you can campaign on it forever? During his second inaugural address, Trump once again promised to usher in an era of unprecedented economic prosperity. Because, that first time went so well. He vowed to cut taxes, revitalize domestic manufacturing, and unleash a supposed wave of economic growth. But his previous term's economic track record paints a different picture. One where corporations and the wealthy thrived, while working-class Americans got left holding the bag. Trump's claim that his administration created the greatest economy in all of history is a bald-faced lie, especially when you consider the context. Yes, the pre-pandemic economy saw low unemployment rates, but let's not forget what fueled much of that growth. Corporate stock buybacks and deregulation that prioritized Wall Street over Main Street. In other words, the rich got richer, and the rest of us got thoughts and prayers. Wage growth for the average American worker? Practically a rounding error compared to the windfalls enjoyed by the top 1%. A prime example of this economic sleight of hand is Trump's 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was touted as a gift to the middle class. But surprise, surprise, ended up benefiting corporations and high-income earners the most. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the tax cuts contributed to a national deficit that ballooned by $7.8 trillion. And what did corporate America do with their newfound riches? Build more factories? Raise wages? No. They bought back their own stock, boosting executive bonuses while workers continued living paycheck to paycheck. Classic! Let's talk about manufacturing now. Trump claiming he would bring back American manufacturing. But instead, the industry stagnated and lost nearly 170,000 jobs in 2019 alone. 2019, pre-pandemic. His much-hyped trade war with China was less of a strategic masterstroke and more of a slow-motion car crash. It raised consumer costs and slapped farmers and small businesses with retaliatory tariffs. It turns out winning a trade war is a little more complicated than firing off an angry tweet. Then there's Trump's favorite talking point, reducing the national debt. Here's the thing. You can't claim to be a fiscal conservative while spending like a kid in a candy store with a stolen credit card. Between the tax cuts, increased military spending, and corporate handouts, the national debt skyrocketed, leaving the government ill-equipped to handle any real crises, like, say, a global pandemic, perhaps? And speaking of crises, remember the Paycheck Protection Program? It was meant to help small and struggling businesses during the pandemic. But instead, it turned into a cash grab for large corporations and political cronies. Mom and pop shops got the scraps while big businesses cashed in, proving once again that under Trump, the phrase helping the little guy was more of a campaign slogan than an actual principle. At the end of the day, Trump's economic policies were less about creating lasting prosperity and more about inflating stock prices and padding the pockets of the ultra-rich. So, as Trump kicks off his next term with promises of an economic renaissance, the real question is, will history repeat itself? Well, stay tuned, because if the past is any indication, we might just be in for another round of corporate welfare disguised as economic policy. Trump also proclaimed that national unity is now returning to America, suggesting that his administration has ushered in an era of unprecedented harmony across political, racial, and economic divides. Bold words, especially from a man whose tenure has been a masterclass in division, grievance, and finger-pointing. A closer examination of his policies and rhetoric reveals a reality far removed from his unity fairy tale. Let's start with Trump's numbers. Trump's assertion that he's a unifier doesn't quite line up with, well, reality. According to Pew Research Center, political polarization hit historic highs under his leadership, with partisan divides widening on key issues like immigration, healthcare, and economic policy. And when your greatest hits include calling political opponents radical left lunatics and branding the media as the enemy of the people, it's safe to say that unity wasn't exactly a top priority. Then there's his claim of broad-based support from diverse communities. Sure, there were small gangs among, Black and Hispanic voters, but let's not get carried away. Exit polls from the national election pool showed that the vast majority of minority voters still backed his opponent. And let's not forget his policies. Rolling back civil rights protections, downplaying systemic racism, and then encouraging law enforcement to crack down during racial justice protests. If that's his idea of inclusivity, it's no wonder no one is buying it. Speaking of racial justice, Trump's attempt to invoke Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream is at best ironic, and at worst, downright insulting. His administration's handling of the 2020 protests, complete with tear gas and rubber bullets for peaceful demonstrators, doesn't exactly scream, "I have a dream." Well, it doesn't unless you're a fascist. Then it might. Civil rights organizations have consistently pointed out how his policies have disproportionately harmed minority communities, making his unity pitch feel more like a bad sales presentation. On the economic front, Trump's unity claims crumble even further under scrutiny. While he loves to boast about job growth, the Bureau of Labor Statistics shows that the economic gains weren't exactly trickling down to everyone. Wages remained stagnant, wealth inequality skyrocketed, and the biggest beneficiaries of his 2017 tax cuts were, drumroll please, you guessed it, corporations and the ultra-wealthy. Working class Americans? We got crumbs, if that. Now, let's not forget about democracy. Trump's repeated promises to restore faith conveniently ignore the fact that he spent years sowing distrust in the electoral system. His baseless claims of election fraud and efforts to overturn legitimate results have damaged public confidence in democracy more than any external threat. According to the Brennan Center for Justice, the public trust in the electoral process has plummeted, thanks largely to his relentless misinformation campaign. Gee, it seems like maybe Trump is the enemy from within. At the end of the day, Trump's unity pitch is less about healing divides and more about papering over them with grandiose slogans. His track record of stoking division and catering to his base suggests that unity is just another unfulfilled promise. Now for Trump's vision of governance that leaned heavily into executive power and nationalistic bravado. Hallmarks of what history tells us are autocratic tendencies. Promises to restore order, reclaim national sovereignty, and purge corruption might sound like patriotic rallying cries, but dig a little deeper, and they start to look an awful lot like a manual for centralized control wrapped in the American flag. Take his vow to eliminate the presence of all foreign gangs and criminal networks. On the surface, it's a tough-on-crime rhetoric. In practice, it's a slippery slope that raises serious civil liberties concerns. We've seen this play out before, during his first term, the family separation policy, and the deployment of federal officers against protesters. These were both met with widespread condemnation for being both overly aggressive and, in many cases, flat-out unconstitutional. If his reliance on executive orders back then was any indication, Trump 2.0 could see even more governance by decree rather than the democratic process. Then there's his bold declaration to end the weaponization of government institutions, while in the same breath vowing to crack down on his critics and political opponents. Sound familiar? It should. This is page 1 of the Autocratic Handbook. Dismantle oversight while branding anyone who opposes you as an enemy of the state. According to the Brennan Center for Justice, undermining judicial independence and selectively applying laws to punish critics are classic moves used to chip away at democracy's foundation. And let's not forget the deep state boogeyman. Trump's pledge to purge government agencies reeks of an agenda aimed at replacing experienced professionals with die-hard loyalists. This tactic isn't new. It's what leaders do when they want power, not governance. History shows us that stacking the deck with sycophants is how institutions become extensions of personal authority rather than public service. Remember how he cycled through officials in his first term, booting anyone who dared to question him? Buckle up for more of that. But the real trick up Trump's sleeve is his reliance on fear-mongering. His vision of national renewal hinges on the existence of enemies, both foreign and domestic. Whether it's immigrants, the media, or the infamous radical left, his administration thrives on the politics of division. Freedom House warns that this tactic is a staple of modern autocratic leaders who consolidate power by stoking public fear and positioning themselves as the only solution. At the end of the day, Trump's second inaugural speech was less about uniting the nation and more about tightening his grip on it. What we're seeing is a playbook designed for consolidating control and eroding institutions, suppressing dissent, and keeping the country in a constant state of crisis, all to justify heavy-handed measures. Sure, his rhetoric might appeal to those looking for strength, but in reality, that reveals your weakness. President Trump's second inaugural address promised a grand revival of economic prosperity, national unity, and restored greatness. But if his first term taught us anything, it's that rhetoric rarely matches reality. Economic policies favored the wealthy. Divisive rhetoric deepened national fractures. And working-class Americans continued to struggle with stagnant wages and rising costs. Trump's push for expanded executive power raises serious concerns for democracy. History shows that consolidating power while eroding oversight and suppressing dissent poses real threats to constitutional governance. Organizations like Freedom House warn that this trend isn't unique to the U.S. It's a global issue that demands vigilance. The message is clear. Citizens must engage critically, demand transparency, and push for policies that serve the many rather than the privileged few. Holding leadership accountable and staying more informed are more crucial now than ever. As Trump's second term unfolds, the future of American democracy depends on whether people choose to challenge misinformation and fight for real change, because history shows that complacency is the greatest threat of all. And the time has come for a peaceful yet powerful demonstration of public will: a general strike. By collectively withholding our labor, we send an unmistakable message to the oligarchs who profit from our exploitation. We will not continue to fuel a system that serves the few at the expense of the many. A general strike isn't just a protest. It's a declaration that working people will no longer be ignored. Organizing through unions, communities, and digital networks, we must demand economic justice, fair wages, health care for all, and a government that truly serves its people. The choice is ours: stand united or remain silent in the face of rising authoritarianism and corporate greed. Remember, history is watching. Our children are watching. I hope we make the correct choice. Eyes open, voices loud. That's all for today on the Bull Moose Network, where we challenge the powerful, amplify the unheard, and question everything. If you found value in this episode, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. It helps us reach more people and keep the conversation going. Speaking of, don't forget to leave a comment down below. And if you want to support independent journalism, consider donating through the site, thebullmoosenetwork.com. Together, we can keep pushing for a better future. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Eyes open, voices loud.